required on the page layout. You can't choose whether or not that field is there. It must be there. What you can do, though, is something rather unique. And you'll notice the bullet point underneath. A long time ago, Salesforce realized that some of us might choose for specific masters to allow their children to be reparented. Because these relationships are built on their parents, this is something that we can allow, but you have to choose to when you design it in the first place. So when you and I actually build these relationships, you will have different selections on them, and know that masters bring unique things to the table, and we're going to discuss more of them in the next slide. In this slide, as we switch from master to the second of 6 relationship types can be built in Salesforce, this one simply is called the lookup relationship. Unlike the master, the child and the parents don't have to have the same owner, nor, unlike the master, do they have to have the same sharing rule, and or they don't have to have the same security wrapped around them. So the master detail had to have the same security, had to have the same sharing rule as the master, and the same owner. This is not true of lookup relationships. As a matter of fact, lookup relationships allow the most amount of flexibility there is possible, and you can even clear values of fields that you're seeing as a radio button choice in selections when designing the lookup relationship. It is not mandatory necessarily to have a field filled out telling it what its parent is either. Depending on what you do with your lookup relationships, you can make different selections to the degree of how tied to its parent it is. You'll notice the required checkmark box. You could say this has to be filled out if you choose to do so. This is how Salesforce has subtly designed the account to that of, you got it, the contact, the opportunity, and cases. They are just very, very, very powerful black tab lookup fields that connect them. And we can do the same kind of thing when it comes to our custom objects that we end up building moving forward. When you do it, notice the other selection. You could have a lookup act like a master detail in what we call cascade deletion, and design with delete this record also in mind. Now, lookups give you the most flexibility, and in comparing the two, there are some other nuances we should all pay attention to. Ones that we've already talked about have to do with security, access, and ownership. So we know that the field is required or not required depending on the master detail or lookup. But the ones that we're going to pay attention to that take you even further are really significant on this table when you compare the two. We already know that deletion or cascade deletion is possible in lookups, but not normal. It's an alternate behavior. In master detail, it always occurs. You delete the master, all details get deleted. We talk about connecting one lookup to the next lookup to the next lookup. You have many, many layers. For a master detail, you can only take one master to a second detail, and a second detail becomes a master to a third detail or a third layer deep. You can only have 3 layers of master detail on a given object, and know that Salesforce is never going to let you make one of their objects a detail. Standard objects may be masters, but may never be details in master detail relationships. When it comes to lookup relationships, you can have them, the parent or the child, in different scenarios. And those different scenarios include standard to custom, standard to standard, standard to user object. They include, for the lookup side, custom to custom, custom to standard, custom to user object. You'll notice that the user object is defined as a unique and different object, and the user object may never have lookup or master detail relationships on them. A user object uses a different kind of relational field, and that relational field is not lookup or master detail. It is called a hierarchical relationship. That's the only relationship the user object may have is hierarchical, which means it may look back to itself. It does not do that directly. Its special black tab design calls for a different relationship. Otherwise, it would create a loop that would kill your data set. So with the black tab design, hierarchical relationship is one that you may use to have a user look back up to a user, not to another object. In knowing all these nuances, know that there are some other nuances when it comes to the UI side that are also going to affect you. For instance, in lookup relationships, you can, with lookup field, depend on whether or not the field and the choice is on the screen or not, whether it's required on the page layout or not. In a master detail, you have no choice. The field must be on the page and is always going to be required to be filled out. The last bullet point that you're seeing here in comparison is the use of roll-up summary fields. Roll-up summary fields allow you to aggregate data, and we will talk about the details of those coming up. But in the roll-up summary fields, know that only master detail relationships can a roll-up summary be built on the master of the objects. So roll-up summary fields are always built on the master and aggregate details back up to it. You cannot build a roll-up summary field for lookup relationships, but know that roll-up summary fields are allowed on 5 specific objects related to each other. The first 3, account, opportunity, and opportunity product. I'll say that again. The account, opportunity underneath it, and the opportunity product object can use roll-up summaries. So you could count the number of opportunity products and roll them to a deal, one opportunity. And you can count all of the opportunities and roll them up to a single client or account to see how many deals you've closed and won during this year or what the value of them is. So you can roll up these 3 objects, and these are black tab objects. Salesforce has the roll up summary field available, even though they are not master detail relationships. So again, 3 objects: the account, the opportunity product may be used to roll up information. The other 2 include rolling up campaign members to campaigns. So campaigns and its child campaign members. And you might have noted that I said child because it too is not a master detail relationship. It acts as one, and there is some work that Salesforce has done to allow many campaign members to be aggregated up to the campaign level, and a roll-up summary can be built on the campaign to do so. So as we go through, knowing that those 5 objects are special, the only way you're going to build master detail, in this case roll-up summary fields, is on a master detail relationship in your Salesforce. Now, master details, like you're seeing on the screen, do have a special and a 4th type of relationship you should be aware of. This 4th relationship is called a many-to-many relationship. This many-to-many requires 2 masters to be connected to a middle object, or what we call a junction object. Junctions are the bridge between 2 masters. You can never have more than 2 masters connected to one object. So if you have 2 masters connected to one, the question often becomes, which of these 2 is going to control the middle one. Is it position or is it candidate in our example? The answer to this question is, if all organization-wide defaults are the same, position is public read-write transfer and candidate is public read-write transfer, we know that the job application by default is going to be public read-write transfer. Therefore, the first one connected is the owner of the job application. The first one connected is the owner of the job application if all organization-wide defaults are equal. If the security or the organization-wide default for position is public read-write transfer or public read-write, and candidate is now public read-only, the more conservative of the organization-wide defaults becomes the master by default. So in that example, candidate would now be the owner of the job application, the more conservative of the two. So candidate would own job application. In the example of position being public read-write, candidate being public read-only, and for some decision, somebody decides to make position private, it would switch ownership to the more conservative, or the position, and the position and the job application would now both become private, and the position would be the master of the detail object. So again, all things equal, first one connected is master. Otherwise, the more conservative organization-wide default setting is the master of the junction object inside of two masters being connected in what's called a many-to-many relationship. So we've discussed 1, 2, 3, 4 types of relationships: master detail, lookup, and we've compared them. During that discussion, we brought up the user object is special, and a third type of relationship is called hierarchical. The fourth type of relationship we just discussed was called many-to-many. The fifth type of relationship is that of what's called a self relationship, in which objects may look back into themselves, and we know the exception to that is the user object, in which all objects can say, look back in and have this position report to that position. And that is just a loop back to itself. But the user object, because it's special, cannot use that. It uses the hierarchical instead. And that leaves us one last conversation and one last relationship you should be aware of before moving on. And that last relationship is called an external relationship. An external relationship means you are going to take Salesforce's object and associate it to an external databases object. So it could be any object outside. Maybe it's in a Siebel platform, or maybe it's in an Oracle platform, or maybe it's in a, I don't know, another system that you have, and you want to tie those two object sets of data together. Well, the external relationship field allows you to do so. There are technically a couple things you need to know. The first of which is, when building an external relationship, the object that you build in Salesforce that you're going to tie to that external data set is going to have a field, and typically it's a text field, but it may be a number or a email address. But with that text field, you're going to identify it as an external ID field. The external ID field essentially gets mapped to the outside database's key ID field. As the legacy ID field, you're going to bring that in, and it increases referential integrity in the data set that you're going to work with. So special things are done with that field, and we'll see them again when we talk about fields. When doing so, external data then needs some help. Well, we are going to set it up potentially as admins and platform app builders. Know that your programmers are going to be involved because API or application program interfacing needs to be done. Code needs to be written to map the fields from the external database to your database. And when that code is done and ready, you'll decide as part of the process whether this is going to be as an external relationship field, we call a direct or indirect relationship. It matters because your database externally is either going to be the parent or the child. And that's the difference between your indirect versus direct relationship in an external relationship. So know that those are the things you need to know as you move towards your certification. So tying these objects together assumes you know how to build the object, and it assumes that you know an object is not just a table of data. So when we start talking about objects and we start digging into the meat of objects, we know objects come with standard fields, custom fields. They come with page layouts. They come with controllers or buttons that are already pre-built. They come with the ability to build automations associated to them, like workflow or processes or flows. They come with sections that you could build validation rules on. And some validations are already pre-built with mandatory, or what we call required fields. When you work with custom object, know that it's not just a table of data. It comes with all sorts of functionality. And that functionality we remember as CROSS, or CRRSS, configurable, relational, reportable, searchable, and securable. And in addressing each of these areas as we move forward, we're going to make sure that we know that all of these different things are things that can be controlled on an individual's profile. And we would come back after we build the object and deal as we build the object in considering the profiles in our system moving forward. Who gets to see and who gets to use these as part of the steps of building every one of these areas out. One of the things you need to know is that it doesn't matter whether it's standard or custom. Even if it's custom, you will still get 7 standard fields on a custom object. You need to know what these 7 standard fields are. The 7 standard fields include 4 system fields, which are easy to remember: created by, created date time, last modified by date time, and then 3 other fields that you're seeing on the screen. One of them is going to be a field, I'm sorry, not on this screen, but the next screen, and you're going to see in this screen as well, the name field. The second field that is always going to be in your system, that is a standard field, will be the owner field. And the third is going to be the Salesforce ID field. Now, one thing we need to know about all standard fields, doesn't matter whether they're on standard objects or custom objects, is you cannot delete them. But there are things you can do with them, and that's what we're seeing here on the screen. What can you do with the standard field? Well, we know that if it's a pick list field, we should be able to add pick list choices and or modify the pick list choices that are on our system. We should know that if it's a lookup field, we can add filters to it. And those filters can help clean and make sure only the right data gets selected in the first place, warning our folks that this filter needs to be met in order for you to go forward. If it is a number field, and or in this case, you're noticing a text field that we could default with a display format, know that we can format auto number fields or text fields. That formatting gives us flexibility so people don't have to work in it. But aside from pick lists, filters on lookups, format of auto numbers, what else can you do with the standard field? Things you should consider are first, being able to describe that field and help text for your end users, telling them what they can do and what they should be doing with that field. Another thing you could do is relabel the field. If you don't care for the name of it, put a different name on it in front of your screens. So when people are working with it, you would call maybe an account a contact or a student, depending on your use of Salesforce's tool. So you and I can change labels for it. And then finally, you can certainly add or take away the field from view, and that is with what we call FLS, or field level security. Although you can't delete the standard field, we can drag them off the page layouts, or with field level security, depending on the field that you were talking of. So even the standard ones, we can say this group of people do not get to see and or do not get to edit that field. Two of the three choices, and the default being everybody sees and everybody edits the field in the first place. So FLS being the last of the things we can do and modify with standard fields. Now, I had told you there are 7 standard fields for custom objects, and that's what you're seeing on the screen. You should know that for those 7 standard fields, and again, restating them, created by, created date time, last modified by date time, the owner, who's the person that typed it in for the first time, the name of the field, whatever you decide to do with a name, a text field, or auto number for the name of the field. And finally, the one you see at the bottom is your Salesforce ID. Notice Salesforce ID is never built as a field and put onto your page layout. That Salesforce ID in Classic is viewable, like you're seeing right now, as a 15-character case-sensitive ID. In Lightning, you may also see it in its URL on a record as an 18-digit case-insensitive ID. The only way, and one of the best practices I use in data, is to get that as a field, is to create a formula using the case safe ID function. And it's a field with that function that'll produce the 18-digit ID that you would select to keep, usually just for platform app builders in the back of the tool, and or for administrators to do their work, and nobody else needs to never ever see those necessarily, that field. It's when we end up going to clean our data, manipulate our data, work with our data, that special formula field that we could create, which would give us access to the 18-digit ID, becomes very, very important to us down the road when working with data itself. So if we know that we've got a ton of details and 7 standard fields, even for custom objects to be concerned of, we know that once those are built as part of the object being built, we can go build our own custom fields. And in building our own custom fields, we know the beauty of that is because we can delete a custom field anytime we want. When talking about deleting fields, we know that with deleting custom fields, it doesn't necessarily go into oblivion. It goes into what's called a recycle bin. And that recycle bin, because it's custom, will hold on to it for 15 days before it purges that field out of your system. That recycle bin is only attainable in Salesforce Classic at this juncture. So you'd have to switch over to Classic to get to a recycle bin on the object set of data in the back end in order to bring it back into production. So in case the scenario was your boss says, I don't know why we use it, delete that field, please. You delete it, and then 500 of your closest friends comes out and says, oh my goodness, you deleted all my data. You can go back in and retrieve it and pull that field back into production. Now you'll notice in the custom field, the custom field screen is pointing out something unique. We know that custom fields come in different flavors, what we call data types. So we could do pick lists, text fields, number fields, But you'll notice in the API or application program name, so the application programming interface name, the code name, every single API, or in this case, API name, custom field name, is going to always have a double underscore and C at the end of it. When you build the field, and once it's been allowed to be saved as a field in your database, Salesforce appends a double underscore C to show you that it's custom. Know that for API names, it's going to default, and any space that you put into a field name is going to be replaced by underscore. Know that you cannot use custom characters and or start with numbers for your API names. So when you and I go through this, labeling convention and labeling naming convention matters to you moving forward. Now, with custom fields, and knowing there are tons of custom fields we can build, what are they? You should be able to identify these different field types. What's more is, as a platform app builder, given a certain scenario, you should be able to identify which of these are unique compared to everything else. And for each one of these, how many steps would it take to build that field, and what are the details of each step? For instance, if I were to ask you, simply put, what are the differences between all of the text fields, and which one of these 5 different text fields is special? Tell me which one's special compared to the others. You should know that as an administrator platform, each one of the text fields is different because of the number of characters it brings to the table to start with. So knowing that the largest in the rich text, long text, and rich text can be expanded to 131,072 characters, you and I would know that the one that stands out is the encrypted text field in particular. Reason? Because we're going to find out right now that field types at any time can be changed from one field type to another by the platform app builder or app in the administrator in your system. So I can take a number field, convert that over to a text field, and I can make that happen at any time, so 6 months or later. Now, there are consequences to doing things like that we're about to talk about. But before I get to it, no field can ever be turned into an encrypted text field, nor can a text encrypted field ever be turned into any other kind of field in your system. It cannot be done. The text encrypted field is the one field in particular that has its own security around it. And in order to get to that security, you have to go to a person's profile and offer that security through the system requirements in that profile. So know that that person that can get to encrypted fields, know that encrypted field is not the same thing as field level security. Encryption for you and I would be, simply put, you and I trying to make a credit card field or a social security number. In the social, I think we call them social, instead of security numbers, social identification numbers for other countries. So when we do this, a credit card number, we would want to see maybe the last 4 digits, but not the rest of the credit card number. And that would be an example of an encryption format for credit cards that comes out of the box. Now, you can design your own encryption, and you do so through validation and regular expression applied to a text field like this. But in this example, this special field would show all of the numbers only with the actual extra capabilities of a profile system settings being turned on. Now, that's not the only field that's special there. But in speaking to the text fields, you would have to be able to address, what about the other text fields? Like, what does the rich text area bring versus long text area? And when we look at the remainder of the field types, can you address what are the different steps we go through? Do you know that for every field type, except for your relational field types, you technically have 4 steps rather than 5? In the relations, you've got to actually take an extra step of pointing, where do I want to get this data from? And step 2, that's what you do during a relationship field being built. When you build these, other special fields do get applied. Two you should know right off the top of your head, the calculation fields of roll-up summary, which we know can only be applied on a master of a master detail relationship, and that of a cross object, or we call an advanced formula field, in which these two fields are technically not just fields in your system, but can act like very, very limited controllers. With that in mind, you want to go back and get into the details of your field types, because I guarantee you are going to be asked at least one question of, well, what if I take one field type? Is it okay if I switch it to another field type? And this is something you need to know details of. When changing custom field types with the Change Type button, know that the moment you use the Change Type button, you potentially could lose data permanently. So before you ever mess with your fields, before you mess with any of your data, you should always, always, always back your data up. And then if you have to consider changing types from one to the next, know the consequences. The examples that we see on the screen may be examples in a scenario that you come up. So if I change from date to date time, for example, well, we know the date to date time, a date field just has your month, day, or year, or in this case, in some countries, day, month, year. So that's fine. So when we do that, if it goes to a date time, instead of being just a plain old date, what happens the moment you press that button is it adds a midnight hour of the date time that you are in and applies that extra time frame to that field. So every field would have a midnight time frame on it based on the date, which might work for you moving forward. But what if you did it the other way? What if you went from date time back to date? The moment you press the button, the date should be fine. It'll get moved into the new date field just as you planned. But what happens to the time frame is it gets permanently and immediately deleted out of the data set. So it does not exist anymore is what I'm telling you. Other combinations that you might consider off this list, or even combinations not on the list, would be an example of, is it okay for me to take a number field and make it a text field? Okay, so yeah, actually, as long as the text field is as big as the number field is, it should work just fine, because numbers can be put into text without a problem. But if I go the other direction and I take the text field and move it to a number, anything that is not a number is going to get permanently and immediately deleted. So you got to be careful with changing of field types as you move forward. Now, there are many instances where we need to do this, and this is where you need to be able to address those situations in an appropriate way. There are actually 28 combinations, not just ones that you're seeing limited here, but for every, one of your fields, there are consequences to changing these fields to a different type. And I would go through these examples being prepared for your certification moving forward. With that, going through the steps of building a field, you should know what a custom field brings to the table. And in those custom steps I had mentioned in a custom field, there are typically 4. Those 4 steps include first, picking what type there is. The second step are what you're seeing on the screen now, the other field attributes. So from typing in the name of the field to typing in both the description and text, we know, and I'm preaching to the crowd, I'm sure, when I say every field should have a description. So in knowing that's the case, in descriptions, I'm going to point out that helps you and me, the people in the back end, the platform app builders, the administrators, the developers, to help speak to each other about what's going on. I've probably jumped into as many databases as many of you have, and in doing so, you find blanks everywhere thinking, oh my gosh, where does this come from? That's the way to prevent it, is with a decent description. Now, a text field or a help text field, it displays for your end users. The prompt is different than a regular description. It's not for us in the back, it's for your front end to know best on how to fill this field out, or what is this field about. There are 4 other options depending on the field that you're looking at. In the general options, these are really important. You'll note that required field is a big, big deal. Required, I will tell you right now, is not something you take lightly or do often. The required checkmark box when building a field is actually a metadata requirement, an API and UI requirement. It's like the hammer of Thor for fields. So only certain types of fields can be made required. You should know what those fields are. Fields like date fields, fields like field that we're talking about looking at right now, a number field. When you make it required, know that if you make a field required here, it is required in the Salesforce object and everywhere that this field is associated to all the time. It means you can't hide the field anymore. It means it's always on the page layout. And even if you try and mass load data from an external system, if it does not have this data filled out, it will error out of your system. This required is metadata required. It's API and UI requirement. And it's one way we call making a field validated in Salesforce standard validation rules. It's one of two ways to make a field required. This is the hard requirement. Unique. This field could be made unique. It means it could be made case sensitive or case insensitive unique. Those are the two versions, and it too is a version and a form of standard validation. We're going to come full circle on that standard versus custom validation later. So on a field, the second form of validation out of the box is just simply clicking on a checkmark box called unique, and then defining whether it's case sensitive or case insensitive. The third form of validation, standard validation that you're seeing on the screen, is what kind of field you built in the first place. For instance, if it's a number field, somebody has to type a number in, so we validated that you're doing the right thing in the first place, and it's called data type validation. So there are three forms of standard validation you're seeing on the screen, and it's simply a field, and Salesforce has provided us easy ways of getting better, cleaner data in our system. Now, continuing down our general options list, you're seeing external ID. External ID is a check mark, and it says this special field is associated and tied to a key ID from an outside system. You do not get an unlimited number of fields that you can build or tie to external systems in Salesforce. In this, for any one given object, I believe that limit for enterprise and larger sets of data is to tie no more than 7 external IDs per object. So when you and I go on, there are some fields that we can default values for. So if the number was always going to be number 5, we could actually default a value as a form of data type and type the number 5 in and always have that filled out here. In this case, the pre-populated field data can be used in other types of fields as well. While this is a number field, know that you could be using date fields or other areas. So you and I have covered a whole bunch of information. And what I'd like to do is the top of the hour, give us all, because we've been sitting for long enough, a little bit of a coffee and restroom break. And we are going to come back to go ahead and continue through the remainder of Module 2 and head towards 3 and 4 for our afternoon section. So with me, what I'd like to do is put a pause on this. It is approximately 5 minutes after the hour. And for me in Pacific Coast time, that'd be 5 minutes after 11. And we're going to take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 20 after, and we are going to pick up with our schema and schema builder. So ladies and gentlemen, as always, if you have questions or follow-ups, Jeff is taking care of you. And Jeff, thank you for my timeout. And Jeff, thank you for all the answers that you're helping us with on the community that we have available for everyone. And we will see everyone on this call in 15 minutes. So we are currently on a 15-minute break. I'm going to place myself on mute, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.
Same thing, really. Yes. I was looking, I was like, I heard it. Oh, is his phone there? Yeah, I didn't know you were calling him. I'm like, I hear a phone. Where is it? Oh, hell. You busted my bubble, Christy. Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's alright. It's alright. It'll be okay. I think I cut myself off the lid. Oh boy. I'm glad you got that. Yeah, it's still crispy, but I think I'll be okay. I think I'll be okay. I think I'll be okay. No, we'll be okay. We'll be fine. It's so good to work with you. I'll miss you. Seriously. Like, keep in touch. Every time you're official. How's your ride feeling? Seriously, let me know. Yeah. Yeah, like you said, I believe it's yeah. Yeah, I want to make sure that all the stuff that like that. I think that's a good thing. So it takes a while. like Mario, but right now, I'm like working with making sure that it's awful. Okay. So that's like, yeah, yeah. Well, now you can laugh about it. No, you have to call and like, you know, you stuff. Oh, that's stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome back. We're just getting back online with everybody, and we have just completed our first of 2 breaks today, and we are coming back in. For those of you that have just joined us, up to this point, we've done an overview of the class, overview of how we have designed this presentation, and how we have based it off of the certification study guide and the percentages of what you've been studying and hopefully will be studying moving forward as you become certified platform app builders. We introduced where our questions and answers for this session are being placed. We have asked you to ask those questions in the platform app builder study cohort in our community, and you can find that under collaboration tab once you've logged into the Salesforce Trailblazer community. Again, that's the platform app builder study cohort. And I would like to thank our instructor, Jeff Susich, for all the work and details that he's providing as we go through and you have your questions. With that, we are in the midst of finishing up the section and portion of this session, Module 2, in discussing the model in our model view controller paradigm. We are now headed from our fields, in which we just finished discussing, to an overview, and that is of the schema builder. And that schema builder is a tool that you can find as a platform app builder and or administrator in your Salesforce in the back of your Salesforce tool. The Schema Builder does a number of different things. As you can see the snapshot on the screen, it allows you a graphical representation of your schema, or what we call ERD, entity relationship diagrams inside Salesforce. But it does so much more. When it comes to looking at the objects that are both standard and custom, you can see all of the fields on that object within each separate object separately. You can not only see those fields, but you can see the relationships and what fields are mandatory with the red bars next to each of the different fields. On the left-hand sidebar of the Schema Builder, you'll notice that there are two tabs. One is Objects, which is highlighted here, the second of which is Elements. These objects that you're seeing will show those relationships in either blue or red. Red denoting master detail relationships, and blue lookups. They also denote in the lines themselves which is the master and which is the detail. The one side being the parent in the blue to many children, from the account to the contacts in this example, as a lookup relationship. And in the account back to itself, a red showing an account or a parent account may have many other accounts associated to it. An example of why you might use something like that is that of if you were tracking franchises or accounts related to each other. A good example in franchises would be, could one corporate McDonald's or corporate Jack in the Box or corporate Taco Bell have many, many franchises that are under it? And in this case, it shows you yes. So it has many others which could be denoted. When we go there, we know that there are external and or foreign keys that can be denoted as well. So as you look inside of each of the fields, you might notice that in the contact, it has a connection, or in this case, a lookup to its parent called the account. Again, as you go down those fields, you'll notice that you can also see which fields are mandatory, which means what fields your end users must fill out in order to save a record. Now, this is not all that the Schema Builder does. The Schema Builder itself can be used to build, if you'd like, your actual schema out. The caveat to this is the Schema Builder only takes into account, when building objects or building fields on those objects, the ability to take the first 2 of 4 steps in your build into account. You do so by switching the Object tab to the Elements tab on the left-hand side and drag and drop appropriate icons onto your overview or layout. And on this layout, you would get, in building an object, a literal pop-up that would give you step 1 and step 2. Those step 1 and step 2s would include what is the name of the object, and when building an object, the details related to it, such as, do you want to turn on the ability for reports? Do you want to turn on the ability for searches? This is true of building fields. It will take into account steps 1 and 2 of building the fields. So what is the type of field you're building? By dragging the right type onto the object that you were looking for. And then it will take into account step 2, which includes the name of the field and includes the details that you had seen on the previous screen. Things like, is it required at a metadata level, or is it unique? And you could add those details. What a Schema Builder does not do are steps 3 and 4 in building of fields and or of objects. Step 3 is the field level security, or the object CRUD settings. These are not steps that are taken through the Schema Builder, and are steps you would have to do individually, either back on the field, the profile, or the account object. And then finally, step 4, whether or not this is visible, or for an object, whether or not there's a tab that makes it visible for it down the road. Those steps are not accounted for on the Schema Builder. When looking and working with the Schema Builder, you'll notice that the Schema Builder buttons up above do give you view options. Know that the view options do not include the ability to print out the schema. So do not include the ability to print out the schema. But it does give you that wide overview and the parameters in which you can use the schema builder to not just see what's going on in your org with the active objects that you have, but also be able to move and or build using this tool. Very, very powerful tool, and one that gives me a great overview of what org and what's going on with the org as we look into the back end. One of the things to consider when doing that and working with your schema is whether or not you do have external objects. And while we discussed it again, we're going to reiterate that there are a couple of things that you need to do as far as preparation and building an external object and connecting it to your Salesforce. That data coming from the external object and your data would be to build a custom object, and as part of the custom object, you would tie it to your external systems table. The field that you'd use to map would have to have an external ID as an identifier on one of three types of fields. Those fields would include text field, a number field, and or a email. These fields that map and would map directly would increase referential integrity between the external systems and tie those key ID fields to your Salesforce. This also means that the remainder of the fields from the external database would need to be mapped as well. Know that the reason you might tie an external object into your Salesforce and data is because that external object has confidential information. Example, for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA as we call it, we know that that information is confidential and needs to be stored outside of Salesforce if it was with patient's information for medical. This data would be stored in your own system, but some of that data you would want to make available in your Salesforce. So in order to do so, an external object table would be built in Salesforce, connected to that external object, and allow your object in Salesforce to both search and interact with that table set. Know that there is two different ways of doing that, and it depends on whether the external table in the external object or your table in Salesforce is the parent or the child. The difference is called an indirect versus a direct relationship. And in doing so, know that we, setting up these objects, would call in a developer to continue to map through API or application programming interface the code to tie these two objects together. With that, some of that code and some of that work to be done and bringing the data in initially with different tools. And this is where we go from our objects and our fields and relationships to our data conversation. And there are two different tools that Salesforce provides out of the box, one which is built into Salesforce itself, and the second of which is a Salesforce API, or third-party program and application programming interfacing program that you would install on your desktop called the Data Loader. In doing and working with both these tools, you need to know the nuances and differences. The Import Wizard, being the original tool to work with Salesforce, has certain limitations and capabilities it comes with. Some of those certain limitations you're seeing on the screen. First of which, the Import Wizard doesn't need to be downloaded, it's built into your Salesforce. It doesn't matter which of these two tools you use, know that in both cases, data is what you're bringing in. So when bringing in data with the Import Wizard, the files that you would work with is a CSV or comma separated value type of file. This is true of the Data Loader itself. But when working with the Import Wizard, you can only load to a maximum of 50,000 records. When you do so, and you bring in that data, there are three ways with the Import Wizard to bring the data in. With new data, and it's never been in your Salesforce, with updating
So you're saying
data,
whatever this
so
POS
taking the
happens to be,
records and
place it
loading them
a
into it
field on
over the top
account.
of the data
So
that
it's
you
not the
currently
PDM.
have, or what we call updating your data, or in a
Oh, for
third
their marketing?
way,
Add
and
a
that's
new
called
field
the
here?
upsert of data.
Call it the POS.
So
like
whether or
POS.
not you don't know these fields exist, or in this case, the data exists, not the
Then couldn't I
fields,
create
the
criteria
data
where-
exists, you can do an upsert feature. Know that the import wizard only allows you to insert,
I hope so.
update, or
But stop
upsert
listening about an
based
hour.
on
No,
different
Mario, he's not almost done. This
objects.
is supposed to go
And
until
those
6
limited
p.m.
different objects, I remember with a certain mnemonic. The
And how many
mnemonic
hours was
being the
that?
first letter of each object. And for me,
Who is it?
Corcoran, I remember it by
9 to 3
knowing
Pacific time.
C class. CCCLAS. C class. Custom objects, contacts, campaigns, leads, accounts, and solutions are the only
Field loader
objects
versus import
of
wizard.
data you can bring in with the import wizard. Again, C class, CCCLAS, custom objects, contacts, campaigns, leads, accounts, and solutions are the only objects you may import using the import wizard. When doing and working with the import wizard does bring a couple of unique features with it. Those unique features include the ability to use assignment rules, and knowing an assignment rule means that you don't have to necessarily have the owner of the record directly associated with the data set you're bringing in. It allows you as an automation tool to use its ID to route those imports to a particular user and or a particular
If she's
queue.
going to go map from the Salesforce
This
account
is
ID
one
based
of
on
the couple of
external
features
PDM
the
number?
import wizard brings to the table. The second is very important, and it is a checkmark box that's easy to overlook in part of the process. It is incredibly significant because it's the only tool that allows for you to, by default,
But it's
bypass
still going to be at the
all
owner level.
workflow and processes as of this last spring.
So what were you saying?
It allows you to bypass all workflow and processes as part of the importing of your records. This could be very, very important as a feature.
Into the account.
Now, you can choose to run
the
the
maturity
workflow
bureau.
and the processes by turning on a checkmark box, but by default, it is turned off. An example of why you might consider leaving it turned off as its default is if someone had asked you, for instance, I need to know when all of these new leads come in, if they're good sized leads, I would like you to send me an email.
I'm happy to know.
So you would load 20,000 records. You certainly
Not a
don't
good
want
time for that.
20,000 emails being sent to
I
that
need
person
his help to hurt
as
my
part
brain,
of a
help my brain
workflow
unhurt.
automation.
And he's not helping me.
So you would know that the import wizard, by default, bypasses the workflow and processes as of this last spring's release. So when we do this, know that it never ever bypasses validation rules. It does not bypass validation rule. The only way to bypass a validation rule is for you to have coded a bypass in the validation rule itself, in which you're exempting a set of data from running on that rule. Now with the import wizard, we know it's manual. And as you go through the process of the import wizard, knowing that you only have a limited number of objects that you're allowed to import with it, and a number literally less than 50,000 being the top, you should also know that the import wizard is a manual tool. You have to map each one of the fields that you're bringing in from the data set you're working with to the fields that are in the object that you're bringing. When you do that mapping, know that that mapping, and when you press on go to bring the data set in, allows it to come directly to one of those objects, but also know that the import wizard gives you an output file to the person that is, and it's not an output file, it's actually an email that gets sent to the person that's loading the data. This email simply states how many records are being brought in the first place and accounted for in your CSV.
Parse that.
It
That-
then will
That's
give you a
what I was
line,
thinking, 'cause
and
then
the
I could
line
create
will be a
the
number of
dealer
count of
POS number could
successful
be a
imports,
formula of
and a
from
second
the dealer
line
reference.
Right.
on it
So
will
then the
give you a
question
number
is,
of
how do you-
failures. If there are failures, there will be a third line explaining a general validation or something else that has been broken. Unfortunately, the import wizard does not give
It's a
you
cross-formula.
exactly what files.
Should be
So
like
if
a
you bring in
cross-formula
20,000 records and 10,000 were brought in
lookup.
successfully and 10,000 were not,
It's
it is your responsibility to go back and find out which 10,000 were not. This is why many of us
Salesforce.
choose to use the data loader, because in its process, it will give you both a success and an error file separately, which will be stored in your choice of location. And that success and error file will give
Just
you
after
not
the
just
DRS,
a list of all of the records that were successfully brought in, but a separate record of all of the problems that were had and records that were not brought in, potentially due to duplication and or validation errors, and for each one tell you what the error is. Now that brings up one of the many differences the data loader brings to the table. The data loader, on the other hand, is a third-party tool. It is an integration and a tool owned by Salesforce, and in order to use it, you have to download it to your desktop. When downloaded to your desktop, because it's a separate program to that of Salesforce, you have to, as part of the process, choose what tool and portion of the tool you'd like to use. Like the import wizard, it too has the insert, update, and upsert feature. But know that it goes further. The data loader will also allow you to export or export all records of an object. It will allow you to delete or delete all records of an object. This makes it incredibly powerful and a brute force tool that you cannot just log in and go with. It means that you must have a security token on top of your password, and you have to have the appropriate profile system settings in order to leverage the data loader tool. So prior to using the data loader, or as part of using the data loader, once it's opened and selected on what you would like to do, insert, update, upsert, export, export all, delete or delete all. These features have to be selected, a feature of all of them. One single feature has to be selected. And then you have to go in and get a security token. Assuming you're allowed your security token, you will select to send it to your email address, retrieve that super secret password or security token, which is a 26-character case-sensitive ID, and append that to your password from your settings in your email address. Send it and append it to the login of the tool to use it in the first place. Assuming you're allowed to use it and you go through the procedure, the data loader allows you even more powerful features. You are not limited to C-class. You have given and been given the capability with the data loader to plug in with an API and code to the back of your system, and you get 99.5% of all of the objects available to you being used or not used in your system. It gives you a ton more objects to work with, and it doesn't limit you to 50,000 records. As a matter of fact, the data loader starts 50,000 records with what's called a bulk load. You can use up to and get up to 5 million records with the data loader. If you're doing that, I would highly recommend a third-party tool and a better way of maybe plugging your data into Salesforce, but it is possible to get done. One thing the data loader does not do is it does not bypass workflow. So in order to bypass workflow or processes, you must manually do so if you're using the data loader. This means you as the app builder and or administrator need to go to the back of your tool and turn off them manually. Use your data loader and then bring that data in. And after bringing the data in, turn back on workflow if you wish to bypass it. It too, like the import wizard, does not bypass validation rules ever. The only way to do is turn those off or to have built them into the code of the validation. Now the data loader goes further because it also gives you the ability to write SQL statements. not SQL, but SOQL, Salesforce Object Query Language,
By explaining
which
the
allows you to
remarketing
pick and
field,
choose what set
we
of data
created even
or
though it wasn't on
subset
the
of data
list
you'd
anyway.
like to use. As part of the process, it also allows you to build what are called maps or Salesforce data loader files. These .sdl files can be stored and used in conjunction with a command line and interfacing tool, or essentially put, code that you or a developer could write. You can use these mappings, save them, and then schedule the data loader to automatically run the jobs that you'd like to run. These scheduled jobs are
Maybe
with
they
the
still
use of
hold.
data loader and a command line that would tell it potentially do this every Monday at 5 o'clock p.m. or whenever it is that you
So it makes the
schedule
field
it.
or no? I need
Note
it
that
anyway,
when working with
regardless.
your data,
you need to have
it's
a
best
field,
practice
so it's just a
to not
field
do it
reference number,
during
but
regular
every
business
particular
hours.
But it needs to be
You could have some unwanted effects with your end users if you do so.
yeah.
When you work with this and work with these scenarios and know these tools, know that data loader is a much more powerful, or what we call brute force
I just got my
tool.
recording. Hold
It will do what you
Wait,
tell
no,
it
no.
to do. When using the import
No,
wizard
he's still talking.
and when deduplicating
He
or
talks a
cleaning your
lot
data,
about on
know that the
ton
import
on certain
wizard
slides.
can
then
deduplicate
everything he
through the
talks
use
about
of
is
your
on the slide.
Salesforce ID for any
You have
given
to
record
listen
that
and
you would
take notes.
add
That's why I
to
heard a
your
couple things. I'm like,
Salesforce
wait a minute.
CSV file
Yeah.
when using that tool.
More notes when I.
It can also automatically in the import wizard match up against particular fields that you might need to know about. Those particular fields, given the particular object, matter to you. So when cleaning or deduplicating using the import wizard, know that the account matches against the account name in the account site field. The contact and lead match against the contact or lead's name and or email address. When it comes to your custom objects and or in the past with classic solutions, know that it will match against the name of the custom object or solution and or it will match against its external ID field. When working through these, depending on the tool and depending on what you're trying to do with the tool, is whether or not external IDs will be leveraged. And those will be typically found when working with objects like your custom objects and or your solutions. And in using those solutions and custom objects, external IDs again are the key ID from the external system and the use of the imports wizard or data loaders upsert feature. So with the upsert feature, you have unique things that can be done, and you'd like to dig in a little bit deeper to those. Things along the lines of being able to tie in legacy data and the use of that external ID field, and being able to associate records without physically having to do so in Salesforce, but by just doing it with the external IDs of the records being brought in. With those comparisons, know that these are not the only two tools to leverage. When you go in, the App Exchange has got a number of different suites of tools, some fantastic suites that add functionality to what you're working with above and beyond the import wizard and data loaders capabilities. With that, we're going to go ahead and know that we can now bring in data. It's always going to be brought in using CSV. And when working with your data, now that we've got better, cleaner data in our tool, we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at cleaning it up even more or understanding it. And this is through the use of reports. Know that reports come in a lot of different flavors. Know that there are a ton of reports that are pre-built in Salesforce. And for every custom object, you have the option of building an automatic report for it as part of the process of building an object. A simple checkmark box says build a report for it. But in our example that we're seeing in the screen, know that you may need and want to go further. This means you may want to create your own custom report types. By default, Salesforce report types are either always inclusive of only the object set of data that they're in, or what we call inner joins, an object with another object. In doing so, by default, you'll see all the fields in the report type from the objects that you're working with on the left-hand sidebar. In the top, in the snapshot that you're seeing, the object that is the primary object will be the filter that will be found in the report builder that you can work with in both Classic and then Lightning. In our example, we're seeing an opportunity object in which the filter only looks for the fields off of the opportunity object
so the current record
in the
I'm
top.
on, I need to
We know
look
that
at the
by
account
default,
ID
certain fields
that
will always
account
show up on the report.
and update
You and I,
the
when building out a report type,
POS field.
can actually pick and
What
choose
you're saying.
what fields are allowed to be
What's that?
used on this report and remove fields from the field builder. We can
honestly, I've never
define
heard that.
what fields default in the columns, and we can redesign our own sections as we move forward in building out our own, what we call custom report types, or CRTs.
So it's not what I was thinking of.
Custom report types are necessary for custom objects with other custom objects. These are not built automatically through just a relationship. You need to go to the back of your Salesforce and build a report type to report out on those subsets of data that are strictly custom. Once we've built our own custom report type using the power of what it can do, know that a report type will allow us to put up to 1,000
nice.
fields
The
on a
has
report
a field not being used
for the report builder to use.
Number.
It will also
So
allow us to use up to 60 objects of data by using what's called a related through lookup. Now, knowing that this is the case, know that you may only do that with parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents of the object sets of data that are your primary,
it's in the
secondary, tertiary, and fourth in moving forward. Now, once that has been done and built, we are going to use report formats to build reports out for our end users. There are 4 types of report formats that we can build: your tabular, your summary, your matrix, and your joint. For each one, you should have an example of why you would use or build one type versus another. For example, for tabular, the simplest way you're looking at data, if you want to go clean up your data, you'd pull out a tabular report and you go use that special field I had mentioned that you might build, the formula with the case safe ID, and export that tabular set of data to clean up your data and move forward, and load it back in with the import wizard or data loader, depending on the object set of data you're working with. A summary field is different. It usually allows you a horizontal grouping or access in order to better understand and look at your data set. You can place charts and you can place graphics on these reports to better depict to your end users when looking at a report what they should be focusing on. When doing a summary, know that when you grab the summaries themselves, you may go to a maximum of 3 groupings on any given report, regardless of what report you're looking at. As we go from summary, which has an x-axis, we'll move to the matrix, which gives us both a horizontal and a vertical axis. The matrix, very, very similar to that of what you might have seen or used outside of Salesforce called pivot reports, only allows still 3 groupings, but it gives you a way of looking at your data in a more concise way. They allow for special features, like related dates that you could apply in unique ways. So when doing so, the matrix gives you an X and Y axis, so rows and columns to break your data down with. And finally, you have a joint. The joint is the most recent in all of the different report formats. The joint allows you to take and build out what we call blocks of data. The difference between the previous 3 and joint is the only report type that allows you what are called outer joins. When building a summary or matrix, you would be building an X and a Y based off of 1 or 2 objects. When viewing a joint, you're interested in joining a 3rd and or a 4th object that are not children of the primary, but maybe siblings of. This is where you can use a joint in order to see something along the lines of, I would like to see all companies with their opportunities that have been sold and all open cases for those as well, and the activities that are currently open in the last 30 days. Why this is significant is because ordinarily, in order to build a report, you would have to have a parent, a child, a grandchild, a great-grandchild to put a full report together. In my example of an account with an opportunity, while it starts with that in grouping 1, in order to build a sibling, a joined must be created to grab cases, which is a sibling of opportunities, to drag it onto a platform. This would be true of activities related back to the accounts as well. It's going back to a different sibling.
Let me see if we can
So
do that.
joined is essentially an outer joining of data together.
30 viewer object.
Note that up until this last winter, report formats, only 2 of these 4 are allowed to be shown visibly on a dashboard.
Yeah, you kind of have
The
to traverse
answer
the
to that,
section, right?
Yeah.
which of the 2 report formats can be applied to a dashboard, would be the summary and matrix report. Right now, if you are in Winter 19 and you've turned Winter 19 features on, in beta, joined reports can be also applied on a dashboard. For certification, they will not be necessarily added to that list until it's generally available. And joined reports are not going to, and right now, expected to be generally available on a dashboard until summer
That's the
19.
current value, right?
So know that if you're asked the question, which report
You want the
formats can
ID.
be visible or made visible on a dashboard, the answer would be summary and matrix. If you take your certification past summer 19's release, you may consider doing a little bit of homework on it, and join may be added to that list. With that stated, with your different reports formats, there are some advanced reporting techniques and capabilities you should be aware of. Bucketing is one of them. Bucketing is the ability for you to actually build
into
on
account
a
with
report a
So
bucket.
that's the path I
These
think you have to
buckets may
traverse,
be
right?
based
Is that
on
how that
3
works?
types of fields: pick lists, numbers, or text fields.
So,
When you bucket, the idea is to better organize and better align your organization's information. So if you had
that's
taken the example on the
relationship,
screen,
right?
a pick list field that was an industry field, and you would build a report based on
How is that gonna
industry,
help me?
and you would see all of the different industries that are available from that pick list field on the object.
Oh, so I
Well,
could do like
to
a,
make it more concise, more palatable, and easier for the business to use, maybe these industries are grouped, and that's what a bucket would do. You do not build it on the object, you build it on the report.
account ID
You may build
for this record.
up to, I believe it's a total
the word
of
we're on.
5 buckets on a report, and on that, you may have no more than 20 subgroupings within any single bucket. So based on your industry list, you may take up to 20 of those different pick list
So-
choices and put
so
them into a
technically- so
bucket of
technically,
your choice
What I
called
need
a
to do
vertical.
is
This means that you would group
First,
them
I
and see
need
them in a different
formula
fashion than the
field to
original,
give me
making it
the
easier
POS,
for your business to move forward.
right? If I have that,
Examples of pick
then
lists,
I
numbers,
can
and text
actually
fields.
go into a
Pick
process
lists you're seeing
flow,
on the screen.
do the same
So a
traverse
pick
to
list
get the count I'm looking
consolidated to
up.
fit into a vertical called tech and com,
Yes.
or
and
retail,
then,
or
then once I'm on
services,
that
or
account,
nonprofit.
populate the POS
If I were to
into
do
this
numbers,
account's
an example of
POS
numbers would be
number
if
field,
I were
or
to
the
look at the
POS.
size of a company
So-
being large,
oh,
medium,
so
or
multiple
small.
things.
Anyone that has more than 500 people would be considered large. Anyone
So we have to
over
do 2 things. We have to give the
200
POS
people would be
number
medium,
and
and
basically
anybody over
associate this
100. So
account
there'd be a threshold that you bucket those into in the number field.
of that
The
current
example of a
account
text field
to
would be
place them in
that
the
of
POS
the
account.
example I used earlier in franchising. What
So the POS
percentage
account, look, it would
would
be a
I have
formula-
sold to
would be a formula
to
field the-
global McDonald's versus global Taco Bell versus global Hardee's? When going to each of these global, I know that there are many, many franchises that I put underneath it, and I could group all of these franchises by their names under their parent account and see what percentage of the market that would be. 3 different buckets, 3 different fields, and simplifying and cleaning up your data. When it comes to another advanced feature, One that you could use is called the cross filter. In the filtering section, when building off your reports, know that for any given object that has relationships with others, you can use a cross filter.
We need two things.
In order to do so, though, you would want to build a custom report type.
Mm-hmm.
The rationale behind that, when looking at the Venn diagram on this slide, is we know that accounts with opportunities is built as a report, and that data set is available out of the box from Salesforce
Look up
because it's the inner join, the
of
with.
that.
But to get to the outer join, the without, for instance, on the example that you're seeing, accounts that don't have opportunities and never have had them without opportunities, with the CRT and applying a cross filter, you can choose to now filter out and put onto a report a different subset of data. What's important about this is you can take it further. When you go in and you put a cross filter in and it looks at the opposite of what ordinarily would be there, it also gives you the feature and the capabilities of now doing what are called sub-filters on them. These sub-filters are not based on the primary object. They're based on the secondary object. So in this example, the secondary or sub-filters would allow you to go into the opportunities object and use its fields to sub-filter another set of data out. So very, very powerful use of cross filters. You could use 3 cross filters in any given report, and they are very powerful moving forward. Another feature that can be leveraged in your Salesforce in reporting that is very powerful is that of the custom summary formula. The custom summary formula allows you to build 5 custom summary fields on a report, not on the object. So when you build on the report, know that a single custom summary formula can use any number field. So from your object that you're working with on the report itself. In the example you're seeing right now of a win rate field, you can take a field called 1 and use the counter on the field called 1 in order to find a win rate for a particular group of people. In this custom summary formula, we would be using numbers or the count of all of an individual's closed deals and be dividing all of their won deals in order to get our percentage. This summary formula that's on a report, while it can use formulas, numbers, percentages from the object, it cannot use the numbers, formulas, percentages, or refer to another summary formula on the report. So while there could be 5 on the report, they cannot talk to each other. They're independent of each other as you move forward. Know that building the custom summary formulas will slow your report down a little bit, but gives you a huge view and a very unique dynamic of seeing percentages, for instance, like win rate, and or maybe market share and value to that of the bigger market share and value that you're looking at. So for instance, if you built an industry report and found out what sales and what industries and what percentage of your market is this industry sales versus another, or product sales for that matter, using the exact same example. So knowing that you've got another way of building and looking at your data, we're ready to close up this module now that we've talked about the model, bringing data into it, and how we can see data coming out in unique and different ways. It's time for us to move to Module 3. In Module 3, we move from our model to our UI, our view. And in Module 4, in the same section, we are going to, not the same section, but next module, be headed towards controller.